Good morning. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Scott Flanagan. I'm excited to be guest hosting today for Karen Weaver. Now, the title of this podcast is about trustees and presidents in intercollegiate athletics. We're really going to focus in on that governance role with today's guest. It's my pleasure to be joined by Peter Eckel. Dr. Eckel is a senior fellow in the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. Among his many other roles, Peter's the co-director of the Penn Project on University Governance. Peter is a prolific author, and he grounds his work in sound research, and more importantly, he helps practitioners put that research to use. That's a difficult combination, but it's one he successfully carried off again recently with his co-author, Kathy Trower, in their book, Practical Wisdom, Thinking Differently About College and University Governance. Peter is one of the most astute observers, researchers, and practitioners of higher education governance literally in the world, as he's done work not just in the United States, but across the globe. And he's the perfect person to talk to about the relationship between university governance and intercollegiate athletics, the topic of today's podcast. I always find our conversations to be enlightening and Peter's comments insightful. It's my pleasure to welcome to the Trustees and Presidents podcast, Dr. Peter Eckel. Good morning, Peter. How are you today?
Great. Thanks, Scott. I'm glad to be here.
You know, I think we've talked about a lot of topics over the years, but this will probably be the first time that intercollegiate athletics is a central one. But let's start. You know, you've devoted a lot of time in your career to the topic of university governance. Why do you think this is such an important topic? Why are you so interested in that particular topic?
Well, I think, I've very much spent my career thinking about the intersection of practice and scholarship, and how do we help university leaders and those decision makers think differently about their own work, be more intentional about their work as well. And so, I worked for a long time with presidents and provosts, and when I had the opportunity to become the vice president, association and governing board, it really put me into that board sphere. And one of the things that struck me as I was there for 3 years was about how governance was underplayed and underdeveloped, that it seemed to be an underutilized asset, a strategic asset for institutions. And so it got me thinking about, well, why is this the case? And, there's a lot of, understanding and common shared wisdom that presidents pass from one to another, and that boards develop on their own as well. But it just seemed to be that governance wasn't living up to the role that it can and should be, and provide the value that would really help institutions move forward. As Kathy and I write in our book, there's way too many boards that were striving for mediocrity, and the goal is how can we help boards really move in a way that creates value for their institutions, and recognizing that we needed a lot more time and attention around that topic, both with boards and with current leaders and with emerging leaders.
And that's always been true. And I suspect that, like every leadership role right now, has had some things heightened and some things changed as institutions and leaders try to navigate the course that we've been on for the past 6 months or so, and for the foreseeable future. What kinds of issues have been elevated as trustees and leaders really work through the immediate impact of COVID-19?
Well, I think even before we got to COVID, I think we've seen an acceleration around the importance of boards as those strategic players and strategic assets to institutions in the last few months or last few years, as institutions, as competition, finances, the value of higher education continues to continue to be challenged and under threat in pretty dynamic environments. So, even from moving from my time at AGB into Penn, I saw a change in what we call boards in transition. That more boards recognizing that what they used to do was no longer sufficient for the current environment and the current context. Oftentimes, boards develop that own insight if there's a change in presidents and the new president has different expectations or different demands or for the board. But we also see it from presidents, a new generation of presidents saying, I need a board that's much more active and engaged and strategic. And so I think we've seen that shift over the last 3 to 5 years. I think it existed before, but I think in stronger, higher volume, more institutions in that category. But I think the pandemic has further accelerated some of that change. I think there's some, I think we'll see governance shift both in and through the pandemic. I think the pandemic has pushed boards to very much focus on the immediate and the problem solving, which means that hopefully they won't lose sight of that as we move through the pandemic, that they need to not just be involved in those daily operations in different ways during a crisis situation, but also to figure out the right balance between the oversight work of boards, strategic work of boards, and again, that problem-solving work of boards. I think we're seeing a lot of boards that their current habits are elevated and amplified in today's environment in the pandemic. So boards that are high functioning, that do add a lot of value, that are those strategic partners, that understand the balance between the different work of governance, are continuing in that vein. At the same time, boards that have bad habits, sloppy habits, are continuing in their vein, which creates I think even a stronger challenge for institutions and the presidents as well. And so I think as boards move ahead, they've got to figure out what are the good habits we want to elevate, what are the bad habits we want to jettison. That I think hopefully the pandemic is helping boards think differently about their work. They're meeting differently, meeting virtually. That means they need to prepare differently as well. Oftentimes board members for private boards that meet 3 or 4 times a month or a year may not think about governance or their institutions all that often between board meetings. The pandemic puts higher education clearly on everyone's radar screen is a constant rather than episodic way to spend their time and energy. And I think boards right now are also being overwhelmed by details. They're having to get into the nuances of faculty handbooks and air circulation ratios and student behaviors in ways that they've not in the past. And what that means is that some boards we see some trustees who are overwhelmed by that detail and back away from their governing roles because they just don't understand or are familiar or comfortable with the work the information being put in front of them. Others are actually going the opposite way, and all this detail they see as a great opportunity to micromanage, which puts presidents in a difficult spot. Both of those put presidents in a difficult spot, the under-engaged board and the over-engaged board. And so I think we're going to boards will be more intentional as we move through the pandemic, saying, what have we done the last 6 months, last 12 months, last 18 months? What should we continue to do as we move forward, and how should we rethink some of our board practices? So hopefully the pandemic will make boards at the tail end, once we're through a lot of the crisis, be much more responsive and intentional in how they govern.
What's interesting is as we think about how disruptive this time is in higher ed and society, and in some ways it's disruptive. In others, I would say, and I might even argue more predominantly, it has accelerated trends that were already underway, right. And it has revealed circumstances that were either not seen or perhaps not easy to see, but clearly, and I think that goes, Peter, to your point about the good boards, that's clear, and the boards that struggle, that's clear, but everything is sort of magnified in the current setting. One of the things that you talked about was sort of that where on that continuum between micromanaging and abdication. Right? Neither one's is an appropriate way to govern. Let's talk a little bit about intercollegiate athletics and just share from your perspective what you think the appropriate role for boards and trustees is in oversight and decision-making around intercollegiate athletics.
Yeah, athletics is a tough one in boardrooms, and I'm not quite sure why. I mean, you can speculate around some of these. Now, again, the framework that I like to work with boards and that Kathy and I talk about is boards have 3 categories of work that they're responsible for. One is the oversight. To what extent do they hold institutions accountable? and along what dimensions. The second category is problem solving. When issues pop up, how can the board work collaboratively with the president, with the administration around identifying solutions to pressing problems? And the third is that over the strategy perspective, the longer term, how should institutions be thinking about certain topics? How can the board bring an enlightened and different perspective into some of these conversations? I think the same holds true with athletics. I think effective boards will figure out the right balance across those three categories as they focus on athletics. But athletics becomes, in many ways, I've seen too many boards become enamored with athletics that they forget or they just don't have the same level of scrutiny and care that they have with other types of institutional decisions. There was one board I worked with that the vice president who was staffing the athletics committee very proudly talked about how engaged students are in the fan clubs and the booster programs of the institution. And at the end, it was really just signing up for an email list. And it was, do you want to get an email from the athletics department? And the board kept going back to this point about how important the athletics were to the institution, using that metric. And I was like, have you really thought kind of critically about what you're saying and the types of associations you're making? Athletics, I think there's a big difference between Division I and Division III around what happens in the boardroom, how much time and energy board members focus on athletics across those different types of institutions. And I think it's really about how do boards, again, be intentional about how much oversight should we have with athletics, what are the problems, and how do we frame those problems to work constructively with the administration, and what's the future mean, and how are we thinking about how to position our institution for the future?
What do you think the implications of the current environment are? I mean, I think that the current topic is we're having this conversation is around, fall sports. I spoke with the president a few weeks ago who was adamant, and his seasons, I think, are on track to begin, I think, this weekend. I'm doing this from just south of Madison, Wisconsin, where, the Big Ten a few weeks ago decided they weren't going to have fall competitions. The SEC is taking a completely different approach. Tuition-dependent schools are fighting like crazy to try to have fall season because they're worried about the impact on enrollment. What are some of the ways in which, that environment is showing up, or perhaps should show up, in the kinds of conversations, whether it's around oversight, problem solving, or strategy, that the trustees are dealing with?
I think effective boards will understand the range of issues that institutions and that they face around athletics. And then it's oftentimes what we see, I think the more effective boards are able to understand, or at least ask questions around a common issue from very different perspectives. And so, one of the things I love to hear in boardrooms is when one trustee will say, is there a different way to think about this, fill in the blank for what this is. And I think, if it's how boards and administrations frame the issues, very much shapes the path that they pursue around those issues. So is athletics being framed as an economic issue? That's going to drive certain types of conversations and certain questions. Is it framed as a student health issue? That's going to be framed and drive a different set of questions. Is it framed as a community engagement issue? And that's going to frame some different questions. And so I think the more effective boards will be able to look at, all right, are having conversations about fall athletics from multiple perspectives. And hopefully they've got that robust enough conversation in the boardroom, again, for trustees to say, is there a different way to think about this? Is this just a financial conversation? Is it just a health conversation? Is it just an enrollment conversation? The answer is no. But how boards can take a more complex view of what is already a complex issue without oversimplifying to rush through it, I think boards will be better served.
To what extent do you think things like, having a season or not, or deferring one or whatever, to what extent do you think those are appropriately board decisions? And to what extent do you think those are more, decisions that need to be conducted by the president in consultation with the athletic director, certainly with the advice of the board. But talk to me about where you think some of the boundary lines there are between advice and authority.
Yeah, boards as the fiduciaries, does the decisions set a precedent? Does it shape policy? These are the types of decisions that are board responsibility. It's a gray matter between, is this a strategy and an operations decision? There's dimensions to both. And rather than try to parse, oftentimes, a lot of conversations in AGB drove this as well. What are the roles and responsibilities? What are the lanes of faculty, administrators, and trustees? I think a more appropriate way is, what are the questions that boards should be asking around their fiduciary responsibilities? And so some of it very much is based on process. What are the recommendations the administration is making? What are the assumptions around which those decisions or recommendations are being made? How sound are those assumptions? Are there alternatives to those assumptions? How well have they thought through these decisions? And I think boards should be asking not just on the outcome, but the process questions as well, to make sure that the administration is making sound recommendations and sound decisions. At the end of the day, I think the board does have, the boards are the fiduciary agents and have a lot of authority in these areas, but they also shouldn't be making these decisions in and of themselves without significant input. You need to trust the administration that they're experts, that they have a lot of access to the data, that they understand these issues fully. But boards need to make sure it's a trust but verify approach that I think work well in the boardroom. That have you, from a board perspective, asking the administration, what's the work you've done? What are the models that you've run? If it's financial or student health, what are the assumptions around those? How confident are you in those decisions that you want us to be able to either make or support? That I think that's a lot of the oversight work, is not just second guessing the administration. I think that's where we get into trouble, but it's asking those process questions around those assumptions and the other types of factors that they need to be considering.
And I suspect this is one you talked earlier about, sort of the frequency of interaction. These move so quickly, right? I just saw a university in the Midwest that had announced, I think 2 days ago, that they were planning to have 25,000 people. It was Iowa State, right? They were going to have 25,000 people at their first football game. And then they announced this morning, actually, no, we're not. Or maybe it was yesterday night. So these things are, right, that's not a board action. That's an administrator and a president dealing with public health officials, dealing with feedback from alumni, dealing with whatever the set of factors might be. Almost by definition, it leaves the governing body.
We hope there's an open line of communication around those, the ever moving, to use the sports metaphor, ever moving goalposts that university administrators are trying to kick through. That the board chair hopefully has been involved in conversation with the president. Again, I think the other piece we've not talked about is these are extremely stressful times for campus leaders. The uncertainty, the demands. Higher education is always in the news in the fall, never in the news as much as it is right now, nor around as many complex issues. And so I think there's a lot of stress in Old Main, so to speak, and people have been working hard and in different ways since the fall, or since March, and so people are tired as well. And so tired and stressed does not always make for clear-headed thinking, and makes challenging situations even more challenging. So boards have a role in figuring out how to support, emotionally, professionally, personally, the leaders who are finding themselves in these very difficult situations. Social media only amplifies the stress I think the campus leaders are facing in these very difficult and very public decisions. And so boards have a key role in helping to either deflect some of that stress, minimize it, and support leaders as they try to move forward.
And as I listen to you, it strikes me too that context is so important. So for so many folks whose primary way into college athletics is as a fan, right? That's the primary lens through which they're viewing things. And there's not that much context other than, whether Alabama or Georgia is likeliest to win the national championship, right? I mean, there may or may not be a ton there. You talked earlier about faculty, right? Well, the faculty are going to say, hold on, if we're having to reduce X, Y, or Z millions of dollars from the operating budget, which is, I think, going to be a likely scenario at many, many institutions. Well, what's the opportunity cost, right? Because those chancellors, those presidents, those leaders are dealing with those boards. Athletics is not the primary reality that they're dealing with, but it may be the most visible.
Yeah. Well, I think, I wonder to what extent this is really going to ask a lot of institutions to rethink their relationship with athletics. When I started at the American Council on Education in the early 1990s, and the then President Bob Atwell, who was on his way out when I was a brand new junior staffer, had talked about privatizing college sports in the 1980s. To what extent is it time to revisit that conversation for Division I? The current environment is going to push market much more important around decisions. It's going to create less room, less maneuverability within budgets. If any time is to have this wholesale conversation, it may very much be now. I'd love to hear what Karen Weaver would have to say around the privatization of Division I sports. Should these be wholly owned subsidiaries of institutions, much like other public-private enterprises that we've got as well? And I think these are important conversations for boards. The challenge is that individual boards can't really have these conversations. It's a collective board. It's a set of boards within the SEC, the Big Ten, around this. There's a lot of outside players that shape these conversations, NCAA, and others that make these even more complex. And I think, again, this is a big difference between Division I and Division III around that mission dimension of athletics. Where I'm a trustee at the University of Laverne, Division III sports are very different than where I attended and grew up. I grew up in East Lansing. I went to every home football game from the time I was probably 8, if not even earlier, all the way through college. Very different experience at a stadium with 75 or 100,000 people than one of which, if you want to spend $5, you can sit in the bleachers. Otherwise, you can sit in the field, bring your own chair on the other side of the field at Laverne.
Yeah, I mean that goes to the vast array of roles that intercollegiate athletics plays at different institutions. I want to look a little bit forward. You talked about the strategic role and looking long term. We won't be in this current situation forever, right? I mean, there'll be a vaccine, immunity is going to grow, testing, treatment. I mean, there is progress, and there will continue to be progress. The question then, so that's one dimension. At the same time, and these are some of the same issues you touched on earlier, there are a ton of issues that higher ed is dealing with. Institutional finances are fragile, demographics are changing rapidly. That has an impact on composition of the student body and financial model. You got families and policymakers questioning ROI. You got player compensation, player rights, I think, is an emerging challenge. Issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion have been episodic. I don't think they're going to be episodic. In recent times, that's become more sort of the norm, that issue is centered. So, so do you think, or in what ways do you think this current situation provides an opportunity to create a different normal on the way out? I mean, one way is you just say, well, you know what, let's just hold on and hope that things get resolved quickly, and then we'll go back to the way that things were. That could be one decision that institutions choose to make. Another would be to say, Well, we're not going to wait to see whether that happens. What kind of normal do they want to create? I'm curious about your thinking about, what issues might be involved, or the wisdom you think of create the future versus we have so much invested in the current reality. Let's just hope that it comes back to that normal.
Yeah, I think predictions about the future are really hard because they're about the future. My sense is that we are seeing this confluence of these major social events. I think that the layering of social justice and equity, given, think about the diversity of our Division I athletics, how disproportionately it is people of color compared to the mainstream student body. On top of the financial challenges that the environment is creating, I think these are some important synergies that may very well become a tidal wave for higher education. Boards need to be prepared to recognize those, and I think what this means for boards and for presidents is that they need to ask different questions than what they've asked before. And be willing to make decisions that lead them in some different directions. There may be more will, again, but these are individual boards, and that we need that collective push. I convened earlier this summer college presidents and people who lead academic transformation efforts on different campuses, often around driven by technology. And one of the presidents made this really insightful comment about, he said, each of our institutions is wrestling individually with how do we solve a collective problem. And I think that same individual wrestling with the collective problem is true for athletics as well. Are there groups, I don't think the NCAA or, is an organization like ACE going to step up and really ask those hard questions? Probably not. We can hope that they do. I don't think we'll see much at the federal policy level around these questions as well. But how do we create kind of a collective response to a collective problem rather than the onus on individuals or individual boards and individual presidents? But again, I think it's really going to push. It should be pushing boards and presidents to ask different questions. But it's a tough situation, particularly for a lot of those Division I folks.
Well, and it's a tough consideration because some of the associations that you talk about, it's hard for them to take it. It's hard for the NCAA to take this up. We don't have enough time for it today, but to get into the sort of the business model of the NCAA. But people have said, well, do you think there's going to be March Madness? Now, I don't know much about anything, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be March Madness. Why? Because that's over 95% of the revenue for the NCAA. They were able to get through a year without it, probably by doing all sorts. That's not going to happen again if they can avoid it. And so you have, in addition to the complexity you're talking about, Peter, you also have not always a consistency, perhaps, between the interests of the individual institution, and you could play that out at the conference level and at the association level. And so I think as though we're simple at the institutional level, which it's not, it just, the complexity, I think, gets magnified when you start to work across state lines.
Well, and I wonder, to what extent are we going to see, students who become much more assertive around student athlete rights? We've even, when I was at AGB, this is almost 7 years ago, was when, the first, there was the student labor union move to unionize athletics. Are we going to see this again, driven by campus health? And we've already seen student athletes trying to take a firmer stance on issues of social justice. But I think institutions may need to look really hard at how they treat students and how they treat athletic staff. Compensation is a different world for athletics than it is even from faculty and administrators, and you got to add student athletes in the mix who if they're from families with low income would probably be eligible students and may not have paid a lot for their education to begin with because the family contributions would be low. How do we compensate students who, in many ways, are putting themselves at risk in some of these sports in before a time of COVID, let alone after a time and during a time of COVID.
And as our time winds down, I mean, and they're also having an example, and others can argue whether it's a good example, a bad example, or whatever, but it's certainly an example. If they look at leagues like the NBA or the WNBA, who have been very assertive about articulating their beliefs, about taking action around their beliefs in ways that both preserve their own safety, but also that articulate around societal needs. And I think whether that should or may influence college student athletes will be an open question. But I think, again, it's to this point of context that
Yep.
intercollegiate athletics at colleges, even if they put it in a bubble, doesn't exist within a bubble.
Yep. Well, and I would hope that, one of the ideas I've thought about for a while, boards and institutions do financial audits all the time of the choices they make and of their budgets and other operations. Should we also have a values audit that boards help drive around what are we valuing in these decisions that we're making? And are we elevating certain values over other ones? And are we okay with that? That could be anything from financial aid policy, but also athletics. Merit versus need is not just an operational and strategic one, it's also a value-based conversation. And I think athletics in some ways is a business and monetary conversation, but it's also a mission conversation, and it's also a values conversation. And so can boards create this kind of a litmus test or their own lens to do a value audit of the decisions they and the administration are making?
Well, Peter, many of our conversations over the years have centered around institutional mission and values. So it's probably appropriate, though it was late in the conversation that we sort of leave our conversation at such a common point of departure. I'm really grateful for your time and for your insights around this important topic, and I've really enjoyed today's discussion.
Great. Well, I hope that this conversation will spur other conversations in boardrooms, in campus administration with faculty and other stakeholders as well. It's not definitive. Hopefully it raised more questions than provided answers. So thanks for the opportunity today. Thanks to Karen
for your time,
for letting us drive the ship.
Yeah, right. Thanks for your time, Peter. And listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, that you found it insightful as well.